In this lesson, we're going to be learning about systems and system models, and the learning target for this lesson is to be able to define a system and the characteristics of a system model. So the first question we might have is, what is a system? Well, a system is actually a huge concept in science, and it's a part of the universe that we choose to study. These systems can be looked at from different levels. There's some different sizes of systems. We can look at them from different scales. We can look at them from different amounts of complexity. A couple examples of system is one that we're pretty familiar with here, which is the solar system. And so when we look at the solar system, we have all of these different planets, except for that one at the end, not a planet, that are making up the solar system. And there's inputs, there's outputs to this. We get energy from the sun. We feel gravitational interactions between all of these planets. We have different, we have organisms on one of the planets. We're not sure about the other ones. But there's all of these different components making up the system, and there's different interactions in that system and the way the parts of the system interact with each other. And then we could zoom in on one part of this system and break it down from an even more focused perspective. So we can look at just the Earth as a system. So we take a small part of the solar system and we look at just the Earth, which is still a really big system. But it's another scale that we could look at. And we could zoom in even closer into one forest or an ecosystem as we look at the systems in our solar system or in our Earth. And even in here, we could zoom in even closer and look at this plant leaf as a system, and the system and the components and the interactions that make up that plant leaf. And so a system is really whatever you want to make it out to be, as far as how complex it's going to be, what components are making it up, what interactions are going on. But we have to define the scale. And systems are something that make up our everyday lives, and it affects a lot of the interactions that we have throughout our day-to-day lives. And so as we're learning about these systems, one way that we can learn more about systems is through a system model. And the system model is going to be a representation of the components and the interactions making up a system. So this is going to be a way for us to show what's going on in this system so that we can learn more about it, and eventually we can affect the system and improve the way that we're interacting with that system. And so one example of this, a system model, is this one shown here, showing the carbon cycle. So we have the different components. We have the trees, the clouds, we have factories, we have the organisms, we have the ocean, we have all these different parts of the system, and we have the interactions that are going on in that system. And so we have things like plant respiration, we have animal respiration. These are flows, things that are happening. We have the carbon dioxide cycle. We have fossils and fossil fuels, which are pulling out some of that carbon. We even have sunlight coming in and causing photosynthesis to happen. So there's all these different interactions that are going on between these components of the system. And the reason why we build system models is so that we can represent these and we can learn more about what's going on in the system and how we are affecting that system, or some of the different things that are affecting the system as a whole. So we can see that, if we had more decaying organisms in here, that's going to affect this entire carbon cycle, this system. If we have more factories, that's going to affect this entire system because they are all interconnected. Right? So as we change one part, we can notice how it affects the other parts. So that's where system models are really important for science and for learning. So when we're looking at system models and these systems, there's certain characteristics that we want to make sure that we have in our models and make sure that they are as effective as possible. As you're looking at this carbon cycle system model, there's different parts of it that make it effective for describing things. And the first is the boundary, and this separates the universe from the system. And when we were zooming in on our system in the last slide, what we were doing is we were changing the boundary of the system. So I might have, the overall system that we're looking at is everything right here. So I'm going to draw a boundary around this. I don't want to include the sunlight into this system. If I was going to break this down even more and I wanted to, let's say I just wanted to study one specific part of this system to see how it affects the carbon cycle, what I might do is I would draw a different boundary. And now I'm only going to look at the tree as a member of this carbon cycle system. And so in every system, there's some sort of a boundary. And we have to define what that boundary is so that we can tell, well, what's coming in and what's coming out of that system. And that leads us into our next point here, which is the input. What is coming into this system? And these are the resources that are entering. So as you can see from this, we have, if I drew my boundary right here, right? Well, I can see some of my inputs that I have. I can see that I have sunlight coming in. That's an input. That's some energy that's coming into our system. And there might be some other ones in here, but that's one of the main ones here. We can also see Things like our output. What are some resources that are leaving the system? And you can see from the boundary that I've drawn here, well, we have fossils and fossil fuels, which is leaving the boundary of our system. We also have something, depending on how we draw this system, if we included the atmosphere in this auto and factory emissions wouldn't necessarily be an output. If we didn't include the atmosphere, if we're just looking at what are the parts that contribute to the atmosphere, this auto and factory emissions looks like it could be an output of our system. But basically what we're looking at is what comes out of our system and what goes into our system here, and those are called the input and the output. We also have the components, which are the part making up the system, and so that would be things like my trees, my organisms, my factories. Those are all components or parts of the system. What are the specific objects and organisms and whatnot that are making up that system. We also have flows, which are the matter and energy moving in, through, and out. And so these are going to be normally shown by arrows. You can see that we have the carbon cycle right here. We can see that there's carbon dioxide flowing to that tree. We also can see that we have auto and factory emissions flowing from the factory out into the atmosphere. We also have sunlight energy flowing into this system. So all of these arrows are showing the flow of matter and energy throughout, whether it's the stuff in this system or the energy in this system. We also might have something like feedback, and this one isn't shown in this system, but this is a huge part of the reason why systems act the way that they do, either in our atmosphere, in our everyday life, because what feedback is when an output affects future inputs. And so what this would look like in this system is when I have my auto and factory emissions right here. Well, if I have a lot of auto and factory emissions, let's say this gets to be a lot right here. Well, what I'm doing is I'm increasing possibly the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could have an effect on the energy coming into our system. One thing that we know is that if we have a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, well, then we are going to retain heat and close by the Earth's surface, and we're going to have more energy from the sun is going to be retained in our Earth system. And so that's an example of an output which is going to affect our input. The more output we have over here with our carbon dioxide from our factories, the more input of energy that we're going to be able to have, or we're going to be able to hold more of that energy coming in from the sunlight as heat. And so that's an example of a feedback. It's a process when an output affects a future input. And then we have something like a cycle where matter and energy are recycled within a system. And this is going to be shown in that CO2 cycle where this whole carbon cycle is an example of when matter and energy are recycled in the system. Our matter and energy go from carbon dioxide up here, goes down into the trees, is used to create energy. We get organic carbon, we come down here. Organisms eat this carbon, they give off some respiration, which then goes into the carbon dioxide cycle, which then goes over here and is used as photosynthesis, and then is used as organic carbon, and then animals might eat it, or we might have some go through and we use some resources for our factories, and then they give off auto and factory emissions, and this would then in turn go over here. But we're constantly recycling this carbon within our system, and that's called our a cycle aspect of the system. And so what I want you to know out of this video is that a system is all of the components and the interactions making up some sort of a part of the universe. Our system model is a way for us to show those components and interactions so we can learn more about the system. And then we have various characteristics of system which we're going to need to have on our models to make sure that our systems are effective and that we can use them to learn and to adjust the way that we're doing things. And so I hope that helps you to understand systems and system models and be able to define the characteristics of that system model.